started with a press conference and ended with a global economic shock. Donald Trump has just imposed sweeping tariffs on over 150 countries, igniting the largest trade offensive in modern history. But the real twist? Hours later, he demanded an emergency summit with China, signaling panic beneath the bluster. And while Washington scrambles, Silicon Valley is reeling from another blow. Nvidia, America's crown jewel of AI, just struck a quiet deal favoring Beijing. One move, two crises, and a question echoing around the world. Is the U.S. losing its grip on trade, tech, and the global order? This isn't just a power play. It's the opening shot in a new kind of war, and the stakes couldn't be higher. It didn't come from a battlefield. It came from the briefing room. Trump, now leading the Republican charge in 2025, announced what he called the boldest economic protection in American history, a universal 10-60% tariff hike on imports from 150 countries. From Germany to South Korea, Mexico to Malaysia, no ally was spared. The reason? Unfair trade, stolen technology, and global freeloading, Trump declared. But the real spark came from deep inside the tech war. Sources revealed that Chinese semiconductor firms had made a major leap forward, with AI chips rivaling U.S. benchmarks. That news sent shockwaves through Washington. "There's barely a pause to breathe," came ABC's leaping topic. The administration saw it not just as a tech threat, but a national security red flag. Trump's answer? Full-scale tariff warfare. Punish China. Pressure allies to decouple, and remind the world who sets the rules. But there was one problem. The global economy isn't what it was in 2018. Supply chains are more diverse. BRICS is stronger, and nations once dependent on U.S. trade now have alternatives. Trump threw a punch, but the world didn't flinch. And that miscalculation is where the real damage begins. The scale was unprecedented. Over 150 nations, from allies to rivals, were suddenly hit with sweeping tariffs overnight. Electronics from Taiwan, automobiles from Germany, steel from South Korea, even bananas from Latin America. No category was untouched. His look was grim. Markets went into free fall. The euro dipped, the yen tumbled, currency boards in Brazil, Nigeria, and India scrambled to stabilize their exchanges. Washington called it economic recalibration. The rest of the world called it a declaration of war. The EU held an emergency summit within 24 hours. Canada froze bilateral trade talks. Mexico threatened retaliatory tariffs on U.S. agriculture. Even Japan, one of America's strongest allies, issued a rare joint statement of condemnation. In Africa and Southeast Asia, regional blocs began discussing alternative trade systems, seeking to minimize exposure to U.S. volatility. The White House stood firm. For now. Trump called the global outrage predictable whining. But behind the scenes, American diplomats were on the phone, not to boast, but to control the damage. Because this wasn't just economic pressure. It was a stress test of American alliances, and the cracks were already showing. Just days after launching a global tariff offensive, Donald Trump made a sudden pivot. He called for a summit with China. Not in anger, but in urgency. On the surface, it looked contradictory. But beneath the surface, pressure was building. Despite the tariffs, China hadn't retaliated. Instead, Beijing tightened ties with BRICS nations, increased oil trade with Russia, and secured rare earth deals with Africa. The message was clear. China wasn't cornered, it was consolidating. And that's what alarmed Trump. Sources close to the White House revealed that internal memos warned of a possible global trade realignment, one that could leave the U.S. isolated. Key partners were hesitating, supply chains were rerouting, tech firms were panicking. Trump's demand for a summit was framed as strength, but insiders saw it as damage control. a last-ditch effort to keep diplomatic lines open before the economic fallout accelerated. The ask, a face-to-face with Xi Jinping. The offer? Partial tariff rollback? In exchange for tech cooperation. But the stakes had shifted. This wasn't 2019. And China wasn't negotiating from weakness anymore. The world was watching, and Beijing held more leverage than Washington expected. While Washington was busy playing tariff chess, Silicon Valley made its own move, and it stunned the nation. Nvidia, the US's crown jewel in AI chips, quietly greenlit a licensing agreement with a Beijing-based startup, allowing modified chip designs to be used for civilian computing and data centers in China. It wasn't illegal, it wasn't secret, but it sent shockwaves through the White House. This was the company that helped build the backbone of America's AI race, now granting indirect access to its architecture to a geopolitical rival. Nvidia's reasoning? Market pressure. With U.S. export bans tightening and domestic demand plateauing, China remained the single largest potential buyer of AI chips, even with restrictions. And investors were demanding growth. But in Washington, the move was seen as a betrayal. Trump's allies called it economic treason. Lawmakers proposed immediate bans on all tech licensing to Chinese firms. Yet, the damage was done, because Nvidia's action exposed a painful truth. U.S. corporations aren't thinking like Washington. They're thinking like shareholders. And in a globalized tech economy, loyalty to borders often takes a back seat to business. Nvidia's pivot was just the beginning. Behind the scenes, America's biggest tech firms were sounding the alarm. Apple, Qualcomm, Intel, and AMD, all companies with deep exposure to China, began emergency board meetings. CEOs warned that the tariff wave, combined with rising export controls, could trigger massive revenue losses and permanent market displacement. The numbers were brutal. Apple sourced over 45% of its hardware from Chinese facilities. Intel relied on Chinese server clients for 30% of its enterprise sales, and Qualcomm's chip licensing empire was deeply embedded in Chinese telecom. If Beijing retaliated with bans or counter-sanctions, the U.S. tech sector could lose hundreds of billions in valuation, practically overnight. Worse still, several companies feared being caught between two governments, Washington demanding compliance and Beijing demanding loyalty. Privately, some executives pleaded with lawmakers to find a middle ground. But the political environment was spiraling. In Trump's America, corporate hesitation was framed as weakness. And in China's rise, tech independence was non-negotiable. Now, Silicon Valley wasn't just facing a business challenge. It was facing an existential one. How do you build the future when the world's two superpowers are tearing it apart? As America launched tariffs and tech tensions escalated, the global economy began to shift, not with panic, but with strategy. Stock markets trembled. The S&P 500 saw its sharpest weekly drop since early 2023. European indices fell in sync. Asian markets, particularly in Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan, entered a state of high volatility. Commodity prices surged. Copper, rare earth metals, and lithium, all essential to tech production, spiked as nations rushed to secure non-U.S. supply chains. Currencies wobbled. The dollar initially strengthened as a safe haven, but whispers of de-dollarization grew louder as BRICS discussed alternative settlement systems. Central banks across emerging markets began adjusting interest rates in anticipation of inflation from rising U.S. tariffs. Even the IMF issued a rare warning. Global trade is on the edge of a structural fracture. In the halls of Davos and Beijing, the message was clear. This wasn't just another trade war. This was the possible end of U.S.-led economic order. As tariffs spread and trust evaporated, the world wasn't waiting for Washington to calm down. It was preparing to move on, with or without the U.S. As Washington escalated, the rest of the world accelerated. Toward each other? BRICS nations, led by China, Russia, and India, called an Emergency Trade Coordination Summit. Their goal? Create a tariff-proof supply network insulated from U.S. leverage. Brazil offered food security deals. South Africa fast-tracked rare earth exports to China. Russia expanded energy commitments to BRICS members in non-dollar currencies. The quiet revolution? Digital payment systems. With growing concern over dollar dominance, BRICS nations agreed to pilot a new blockchain-based settlement platform for international trade, a direct challenge to SWIFT and Western banks. Meanwhile, Europe was split. France and Germany criticized U.S. tariffs, but hesitated to pick sides. Yet quietly, they deepened trade discussions with India and ASEAN nations to reduce exposure. Asia responded with speed. Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia positioned themselves as neutral production hubs. Japan and South Korea, once locked in with U.S. semiconductor supply chains, began exploring joint research with Taiwan, away from U.S. political influence. One thing became clear. The global economy was recalibrating in real time. And Trump's trade shock, intended to isolate China, was instead accelerating a new global bloc. One no longer built around Washington. For decades, U.S. China relations have been defined by contradiction. Economic partners, ideological rivals, but now that fragile balance is collapsing. Trump's tariff blitz, once used as a bargaining chip, has morphed into a full-blown economic weapon. And Beijing isn't blinking. Instead of retaliating with equal tariffs, China is taking a long-game approach, strengthening alliances, deepening BRICS ties, and advancing tech self-sufficiency. It's no longer trying to appease Washington. It's preparing to outlast it. Meanwhile, U.S. credibility is eroding. Allies are questioning America's reliability. Global companies are reassessing whether Washington's trade policies are predictable or dangerous. At the center of it all, diplomacy is fading. Back-channel communications between the U.S. and China have slowed. Military exercises in the South China Sea have increased. Economic war has become strategic chess. The requested China summit, once a potential off-ramp, is now a test. Will Beijing accept the invitation or expose America's desperation? This moment isn't about trade anymore. It's about leverage, alliances, and the future of global leadership. And the deeper this crisis goes, the clearer it becomes. The world's two superpowers are no longer tied by cooperation. They're defined by collision. This wasn't just another Trump press conference. It was a turning point. One man, one tariff wave. And now, 150 nations, recalibrating, corporations panicking, superpowers shifting. Trump's call for a China summit may be framed as strength, but behind it lies a quiet admission. The world has changed, and America is no longer the only player writing the rules. Nvidia's pivot. BRICS acceleration. Global trade corridors forming without Washington. These aren't isolated headlines. They're symptoms of a deeper fracture. The U.S. China rivalry has entered a new era, one not defined by deals, but by disruption. And in this new era, every decision echoes. Every move reshapes the map. So the question isn't who wins the next summit. It's who controls the future. For more real economic power plays and global shifts, subscribe and stay informed. 'Cause the next headline might be history in the making.